came back to school, the question that I've heard the most is midwifery. What's that? The short version is that a midwife is someone who catches babies. Notice I didn't say delivers babies. That's important, and we'll come back to it. The long version is this. Since the first daughters became mothers, women have been helping women with childbirth. As far back as there's a historical record, we see midwives. The word midwife is from the Old English, mid meaning with, and wife meaning woman. Midwife literally means with woman. Why is it that some of you have never heard the word before today? How is it that thousands of years of women helping women give birth turned into women going to the hospital, having a baby with a male stranger? My hope today is that you'll learn a little bit about the history of childbirth in the United States, the current culture of birth in the United States, and how midwives have played a role. Midwives attended almost 100% of births in the American colonies. They practiced from their homes, and they passed on the information that they had about birth from woman to woman. African midwives came over from Africa as slaves, and they attended births of both black and white women, mostly poor women living in the South. After emancipation, African American midwives continued to kind of lead the way in midwifery. They were referred to as granny midwives. With the standardization of medical practice, though, the push for doctors, there was a push for doctors to receive obstetrical training. They weren't receiving any at the beginning of the standardization of medical care, and they couldn't really learn about birth as long as women were having babies at home with midwives. So they had to figure out a way to get women to come to the hospital to have their babies. Hospitals at the time were not the most safe places, and would you go and put your life and your baby's life in the hands of a physician who wasn't even trained in childbirth? So midwives were attending approximately half of all births in 1900 and fewer than 15% by 1935. So they did something right. They figured out a way to get women to come to the hospital. By the early 1930s, most practicing midwives were poor and living in the South. So how did we get women to abandon those thousands of years of birth practice and choose hospitals? The answer is advertising. The move to the hospital happened in one generation, and it came with the promise of painless childbirth. Woohoo! The introduction of twilight sleep in 1914 was a huge advancement in modern medicine, or so women were told in the magazine articles that were appearing all over the country. Twilight sleep was a combination of two drugs, morphine, a painkiller, narcotic, and scopolamine, which was an amnesic. An amnesic keeps you from forming memories while you remain conscious. So your childbirth wasn't actually going to be painless. You were just not going to remember it. Scopolamine caused hallucinations and temporary psychosis and required that women be restrained during their entire labor and their birth. They were literally tied to the bed for the duration. An entire generation of mothers were tied to the bed and have no recollection of their child's birth. My grandmother was the third child of 8. She grew up on a farm, and she and all of her siblings were born at home. She was very familiar with birth. She got to witness the births of several of her siblings. But by the time she gave birth to her first child, my mother, she didn't know anybody that was still having home births. They were all going to the hospital. She gave birth to my mother at St. Mary's here in Richmond on January 12, 1948, and she arrived at the hospital already in active labor. She remembers them giving her a small green pill. She remembers feeling woozy, and she remembers vomiting. Her next memory is of her waking up and asking the nurse, when am I going to have my baby? What she didn't realize was 3 days had passed since her last memory, and her baby was 3 days old. She met my mother 3 days after she had given birth on January 15th. So in 1925, around the time that twilight sleep was really beginning to come into heavy use in the United States, a nurse named Mary Breckenridge, who lived in Kentucky, rural Kentucky, had just come back from World War I, where she was an Army nurse, and she had learned a lot of skills from the British midwives that were working over there. And she decided to bring those skills to her rural community. She opened a school called Frontier Nursing Service to train midwives, and that school actually still exists as one of the leading midwifery schools in the United States. So midwives from Frontier continued to serve mainly poor communities in the US, but by 1960s there were only around 70 midwives still practicing exclusively in the South and usually in poor communities. Many states even outlawed the practice of midwifery. But in the 1970s, some doctors began noticing that in those poor communities where midwives were working, there was less infant and maternal mortality, there were fewer premature births, and there were few babies born with low birth weight. This was remarkable, just their results in itself, but especially in those poor communities where those rates are usually a lot higher. So those results kind of renewed the medical establishment's interest in midwifery, and over the next several years, midwifery really started to kind of make a comeback. So what about today? Currently, there are two types of midwives in the US, the certified nurse midwife and the professional midwife, also known as the certified midwife. The certified nurse midwife is a highly trained medical professional. She holds an advanced degree in women's health, usually a women's health nurse practitioner with additional training in birth. They're legal in all 50 states. They usually practice in physician practices, hospitals, home birth centers, and independently as home birth midwives. Professional midwives are legal in 27 states, which means there's 23 states where they're not legal. Virginia does allow the licensing of professional midwives, but they are not allowed to work in hospitals. So if you use a professional midwife, you'll either be having your baby at an independent birth center or at home. The professional midwives are specifically trained in low-risk, out-of-hospital birth, and there's no standardization in their actual training, but they do have to sit for a national exam. Virginia doesn't really have a protocol for determining what is low risk, so that's really left up to the midwife herself. I've been a birth educator and a labor doula for 10 years here in Richmond, and I encounter misconceptions about midwives all the time, so I'm really excited to clear some of them up. The first and most common misconception is that midwives only care for women during pregnancy and birth, and this is far from true. Yes, midwives do prenatal care, and they catch babies, but they're also responsible for newborn care. A newborn is first 28 days of life. They're trained in lactation support and in postpartum support for mothers. Additionally, they do other things. They take care of well woman care. They're trained in caring for women throughout their whole life, not just during pregnancy. They do family planning. They can place an IUD, fit you for a diaphragm, prescribe birth control pills. They also do cancer screenings. They do annual exams, pap smears, biopsy, screening and treatment of STDs, and they can even treat and diagnose and treat a woman's male partner. The second misconception is that if you use a midwife, you can't have an epidural, and this isn't true. Midwives can prescribe all medications pertaining to childbirth. They can induce your labor with Pitocin. They can give you narcotic analgesic. They can give you epidural. I think that sometimes that misconception comes because a lot of women will have their baby at home, and obviously an epidural isn't an option at home, or they're so well supported in the hospital by their midwife that they don't really feel like the epidural is necessary. So midwives encourage the use of relaxation techniques. They use hydrotherapy, which is the tub or the shower.
What was the last?
Oh, the tub or the shower. They use position changes. They help you get out of the bed and move around. They let you eat and drink during labor, which is amazing. So when you're ready to try something pharmaceutical, though, they can provide that for you. Another misconception is that your insurance will not cover a midwife. The model here in Richmond is that most midwives are working in a physician practice, and if that's the case and you're having a hospital birth, your midwife is going to be paid for just like a physician would be paid for. There are some insurances that don't pay for a home birth or out-of-hospital birth, but even the Affordable Care Act requires that state Medicaid pay for any and all midwives, and even in birth centers in states where they're licensed. So one other common confusion I come across is that a midwife is the same thing as a doula, and that's not true. We already learned what a midwife is. She's highly trained. She has an advanced degree. A doula doesn't need a degree, doesn't even need to have finished high school. A doula is really just a support person for labor. There's somebody who comes with you to labor and helps you emotionally and physically cope with your labor. They're a labor coach, and this is very different from what a midwife is as a primary care provider. So the last belief about midwife that I want to talk about isn't really a misconception at all. A lot of people think that midwifery is really different from physician care, and that's very true. Midwives believe at the core of their belief system is that birth is a normal physiologic process, and it works best when left alone as much as possible. Medical intervention is sometimes necessary during labor, but when it becomes routine, we have a problem. The medical model of maternity care holds the belief that birth and pregnancy is a pathology, something to be managed. And the difference in those kinds of care and that kind of perspective that you're coming from makes a big difference. Midwives focus on the patient as a person rather than a diagnosis. This comes from her nursing background. Most midwives start off as an RN, and that nursing background is where she's getting her core belief system from. So remember how earlier I said midwives catch babies? Midwives believe in a woman's own power to give birth to her own baby. Babies are not delivered, they're not pizzas. So what do nurse midwives say about their profession? There seems to be a lot of agreement among the midwives that I spoke to that the pursuit of midwifery starts as a calling. Most of them didn't look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and say, oh, this pays pretty well, I think I'll do this. Pretty much every single one of them felt called to birth work. The midwives I spoke with were really candid about the pros and cons of being a midwife. The good parts, they're really, really good. The everyday miracles, couples becoming families, telling a woman who's battled infertility that she's pregnant, listening and hearing baby's heartbeat for the first time, watching a woman tap into her strength as she births her baby, and watching her man get to watch that. The privilege of being the first hands to hold a new life. But being a midwife isn't always easy. Midwives have to battle insurance companies. They pay high medical malpractice insurance rates. There's more and more women that are seeing the value in midwifery care for their, just for themselves, and there's just not enough of them to go around, so they're burnt out. Hospital policies often don't match up with the way midwives want to practice either. So midwives are usually with women on their happiest days, but consider that midwives are going to walk with women through their dark days as well. During her career, she'll have to give bad news about a cancer screening, tell a woman she's pregnant with an unwanted pregnancy, help a woman make a really difficult decision about an abortion, listen and not find that heartbeat, catch a stillborn baby, tell a woman that her baby will be born with a birth defect, help a mother give birth to a baby that's going to go home and live in poverty. I spoke with one midwife who has recently delivered a baby who was already a ward of the state before it was even born because his mother was incarcerated. Midwives are going to do a lot of difficult things during their career. A good midwife is going to help these women through the tragic events as well as through the joys. For a midwife, kindness is necessary and empathy is essential. Midwifery has changed a lot since Mary Breckinridge's day, but the spirit of midwifery has remained the same. Midwives are with women through the joys, with women through the trials. According to a survey published in the Journal of Midwifery and Women's Health, women receiving midwifery care most valued the caring respect, compassion, and attentiveness provided by their midwives. Caring respect, compassion, attentiveness. These are qualities that I think we all want to emulate in all things, especially in healthcare, and midwives are leading the charge. Thank you.